Welcome back. Today we'll concentrate on the economies that developed in Europe between 1500 and 1800. Let's start with the rapid population growth that occurs in the 16th century, largely as a result of the Columbian Exchange, which improved nutrition and, just as important, reduced susceptibility to diseases. Epidemic diseases such as bubonic plague were a recurring phenomenon in medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in urban areas where they had devastating effects and reappeared periodically. There was very limited understanding of the causes of disease, and the Black Plague is a good case in point. It wasn't until the 1890s that the cause of bubonic plague was definitively established as bites from fleas carried on rats, which were prevalent in European urban areas with poor hygiene. In such areas, the disease spread easily, killing an estimated 50 million Europeans in the 14th century alone. Improved medical knowledge gradually led to the near disappearance of the plague in the 20th century, but not before it produced profound religious, social, and economic change in Europe. Speaking of economic change, let's now turn to the commercial capitalism that emerged in Europe during this period. Its defining elements are freer markets, easier exchange of goods and labor, and a deeper awareness of the dynamics of supply and demand. While well understood now, these economic mechanisms were just developing in the 16th and 17th centuries. The so-called putting out system is a good example of the inventiveness of commercial capitalism. Putting out was a way of subcontracting work to smaller merchants at off-site facilities, either in homes or production sites. It facilitated an increased production of cloth, especially woolens. The system was organized by urban merchants who financed and arranged, through a system of agents, the production of cloth in rural villages and the transportation of the finished goods to the markets where they were sold. This was a novel and fairly sophisticated operation. On its heels comes the development of the real infrastructure of capitalism, banks and stock exchanges. During this era, in selected parts of Northern and Western Europe, the joint stock company emerged as a form of productive enterprise, a company that was open to investment by individuals, but most often was sponsored by the state. The state was typically the chief investor and the organizer of the company, operating on several central tenets of mercantilist economic theory. First, the idea that a successful economy must be based on exports. Second, that it must control the sources of the raw materials it uses. This is one of the reasons for the push to expand and find colonies that would provide raw materials, and in particular to accumulate the precious metals, which were understood to be the basis of national wealth. Thus, Spain became the wealthiest country in Europe by mining gold and silver in Mexico and South America and shipping both back to Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries. In Europe, a fundamental division begins to emerge in the mid-17th century. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War, a period of intense conflict between Catholics and Protestants that involved the nation-states of Spain and France, as well as the Holy Roman Empire and Sweden. The war devastated Central Europe and German lands in particular. What emerged was a period of relative tranquility during which the European world essentially divided into two parts, the North and the West versus the South and the East. In the North and the West, we find the centers of economic innovation and increasing wealth, growing cities that are centers of commercial capitalism, such as Amsterdam and London. The Dutch, the English, and the French are the ascending Northern and Western European powers, soon to become the seats of new commercial empires. In these states, the medieval institution of serfdom, where peasants are tenant farmers held hostage to the land, is almost completely eradicated by the 17th century because of changes in the economy, population, and laws governing tenant-landlord relations. In the South and the East, things are very different. It is far more rural, far more agrarian. There are fewer cities, and they are smaller and decidedly more provincial. In Eastern Europe and Russia, serfdom actually expanded in the 17th and 18th centuries. There were more serfs and more peasants tied to the land and owned by noblemen. The Russian form of serfdom was probably the most extreme. In fact, it was little different than the kind of slavery that developed in the Americas. The populations of Southern and Eastern Europe were largely impoverished by comparison with their Western European counterparts. In many important ways, Southern and Eastern Europe became economically dependent on Northern and Western Europe. While they were not colonies, they supplied agricultural goods to those regions in the North and the West that were commercial centers producing industrial goods and developing a much more sophisticated form of capitalism. In our next lecture, we'll see how this newfound wealth helped create the most important revolution of this period, the scientific revolution. Until then, best wishes.